Imagine falling asleep one night in 1666 and waking up to flames licking the sky, ash raining from rooftops, and the entire city of London ablaze. The fire started with a single spark, but what followed was chaos, mystery, and a transformation that would shape modern London. Ever wondered what it truly felt like to live through one of history's most infamous disasters? Hit play, lay back, and let us walk you slowly through the smoke-filled alleys of 17th century London. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more sleepy journeys into forgotten history. Your next relaxing night begins with a spark of curiosity. You step into a late summer London that is, to your modern eyes, surprisingly dark. There are no street lamps as you know them, only scattered oil lamps and the glow from windows where candles burn low. The lanes are narrow enough that you might reach out and touch both sides at once, and the houses lean inward as if conferring over the street. Beam upon beam, oak and elm, layered with lath and plaster, jutting upper stories pressing down like shelves of a library too full of books. The city breathes through timber. It creaks when the wind stiffens. It sheds, too, straw scattered from carts, chaff sticking to cobbles, sawdust sifted from a joiner's bench, the tiny powder of flour that clings to hands and cloth in a baker's lane. That is the scene as Sunday draws near, and you are awake, when most others are asleep, the air holding the warmth of a dry season that has gone on longer than people like to admit. Summer has been unkind to wells and pumps, parching the soil and reminding Londoners, as the fires in their hearths shrink to embers, how closely comfort and danger sit. You find yourself walking inwards from the river, where wharves of timber, pitch and resin give the Thames a particular smell, a resinous sweetness overlaying the tang of mud. Bargemen murmur over cargoes with gritted patience. The bellies of warehouses press outward. You count the church towers by habit, St. Magnus the Martyr by the bridge approach, St. Leonard in Eastcheap, St. Dunstan in the east, farther on, all alike in their way of making the hours count. It is a city of parish boundaries as much as streets, a grid of obligations and identities that bind people to their corners of the map. When the baker's quarter settles, the heat remains. A bakery never truly goes cold. Bread tomorrow means ashes tonight. You might hear the raking of coals, the slight, careful breath of a man who knows his oven's temperament. You might see flour dust leak under a door like fog, illuminated by a lamp as it floats and settles again. You know, though, that there are places where embers hide stubbornly. A bakery's oven is a maid's son, temperamental and fanged if mishandled, safer by practice than by nature. In Pudding Lane it is no different, a place named for the offal and scraps that once were carried down to the river, humble work that naturally drew trades which could tolerate smells most people fled. The bakery on this lane is part of a sturdy life, apprentices lifting sacks of meal, a journeyman scraping ash, a master named with a mixture of respect and expectation by his neighbours. Those neighbours, whether they approve of him or not, sleep with the same habit of trust in a city that transforms work into routine. Habits are how risk is managed in such a place. You tamp a hearth and you turn your mind to the next day. You trust the same timber that creaks overhead. You rely on the parish watch, the curfew bell, the fact that fires are put to bed at a certain hour. What else can you do when hundreds of thousands of people draw heat to themselves in bowls of flame and coal and candle? Somewhere near midnight into the small hours of Sunday, you smell smoke in a way that is wrong. Not the braided smell of hearth and tallow and bread, but a bitterer scent, impatient and rising. It is a small thing at first. You have smelled rags singe in kitchens, you have watched a candle gutter, you have seen a spark strike and die. But this scent crosses the line between controlled and contrary, and it draws people to doors and shutters. There is a question passed from mouth to mouth that needs no words. Is it close? You listen, and the sounds build. A crack you might mistake for a cart's axle, then another that sounds more like a splitting beam, the startled exclamation of those who ran toward the smell and came back to pull shirts over heads, the skid of buckets being dragged from hooks near a door. One voice says to another to fetch the parish beadle, another says to wake the constable. Someone else, practical and sweating though the night is cool, says bring the hooks. The spread, when it begins, follows the city's design. The houses crouch and lean. The street narrows and then pinches at corners. Chimneys are not always masterfully built. You have seen the ones that shift, and you have been told that the smoke finds any weakness. Heat climbs. This is what houses do not forgive. In a lane with overhanging upper stories, the upper air is a corridor. You watch the wind's breath. Through it, east to west. August has been dry and September has inherited its sting. The wind is willing. That is the peace that makes everything else possible. You watch shutters open and arms extend with buckets. You hear commands borrowed from a dozen rehearsals in a dozen parishes. There are people whose job it is to notice, but when noticing becomes urgency, they need the consent of their neighbours to do the unpleasant thing. In London, one unpleasant thing is pulling down a house to make a gap, a fire break. It is both sensible and ruinous. It saves and it destroys on purpose. There is hesitation because authority is personal. The city's officers do not just wield power, they are held to account for what they spend and what they break. If a house is demolished and the flames never reach it, the owner will want to know why his property suffered the city's hammer. If they wait and the fire reaches, the same question will be framed differently. Why did you not act? You can feel the weight of such questions pressing down on those who ought to decide. Meanwhile, the fire has no such hesitation. In a bakery, a spark finds stored kindling in the most ordinary materials. A board propped at the wrong angle, a pile of faggots waiting their turn in the oven, a linen rag hung too near. The first flame that leaps where it should not is smaller than a cupped hand. The second is larger. By the time the first proper alarm is raised, the inside of a wall is a chimney, and everything that can carry heat upward is doing its unthinking work. You step with the crowd down toward the river, because that is where water is. Buckets dip. Ropes strain. You watch lines form because lines are what people make when they want to feel time turn into action. The river can give, but the distance from the wharf to the flames is measured in alleys and steps, and the flames take their own measure in air. It is a little like a race where one runner becomes more confident with every stride. The fire learns the map of its neighborhood as if by instinct. It tries windows, it tries eaves, it tests the windward side of a street and then dances to leeward. You can track it by the expressions of those whose windows reflect it. A face turned amber, a hand lifted to shield eyes, a quick calculation traced in the tightness around a mouth. Is it time to carry out the chest with the silver, the trunk with the account books, the linen that took so many wash days to accumulate? Who has time to plan for a night like this? And yet you see plans, small ones, almost invisible, spring up wherever a household has a head who has thought about such things. Someone hangs a blanket soaked in water from a window. Someone else pulls a ladder to a roof. Two men walk 6 steps apart, each with an armful of bedding. In between them trudge children, labouring under packages no larger than their hands. You follow the flame line as it leans toward Thames Street, where warehouses hold goods that hate fire. Pitch, tar, hemp. The wharf side is a strip of convenience and danger. A drover points at a stable and shouts at the groom to turn the horses loose. A clerk, with ink-stained fingers, stuffs papers into a satchel and remembers only when he reaches the street that his hat is still on the peg. A woman climbs to the garret to pull down a cradle, though the baby sleeps in her arms, and the cradle cannot possibly be carried down while she holds the infant. She descends again without the cradle when a hand steady on her elbow convinces her that nothing heavier than a child is worth risking a stair that is beginning to complain with heat. You see how a city's reason is divided in moments like this. Part of it seeks to preserve life and limb. Part of it struggles to preserve property. The line between the two is never as clear at night as it is by day. You hear the bells now. Church bells have purposes. They call to worship. They mark the hours. They toll for death. And they ring alarms. Because the parishes are so close, the bells answer one another. The city is shouting to itself in bronze. Bells draw men from beds to hands and feet, and they draw women to bundles. They summon constables and beadles, and they call carpenters who know how a brace can hold, or how a wall can be made to fall as if rolled back. The carpenter's knowledge, which by day is humility and careful pride, now becomes a kind of surgery for streets. But there is still the question of permission. Demolishing a house, even with the clearest intention, is a public act which offends deeply held sensibilities about ownership. Imagine you are an alderman roused from sleep, told that you must say yes to ripping down the front of a neighbour's livelihood. You hesitate because every permission granted at night is a daylight accusation waiting to be written. And yet looking across the roofs you see that the fire does not wait for your cautiousness. You think of the water systems beneath your feet, hollowed elm pipes laid to carry water like a buried swarm of wooden serpents. In drought they give little. You think of the parish pumps, each with its familiar creak, each with its bucket worn smooth by years of hands. Tonight you hear the pumps complain and spit. Water fights fire if it can be brought in time and in volumes that match the flame. Tonight, time has been lost. The first gap you might have cut has widened of its own accord, but not where you would have wanted it. The wind carries brands across the street. That is the moment when a fire ceases to be a fire in a place and becomes a fire of the city itself. You move with others up Fish Street Hill, which rises cruelly when your lungs are full of smoke. On the hill, a city man with authority declares what a man with authority must declare, that houses must be pulled down. But authority does not summon labour out of the ground. It finds the men it needs in the bodies already on the street. You see the hooks, cruel iron on long poles used by day to pull down tottering chimneys and by night to claw at eaves. You see axes and ropes, and then later you hear the unfamiliar thunder of gunpowder being used to blow gaps where hooks cannot work fast enough. In the earliest hours, though, the gunpowder lies in stores that no one has yet dared to open, for fear that sparks might find it before men can carry it. The first demolitions are slow and handmade, a tug-of-war between a city's stubborn fabric and the impatient logic of the flames. From the hilltop, you look west. The map in your mind is dotted with things you could name: the market at Eastcheap, the street of fishmongers and grocers, the guild halls where men in livery debate things most people would call dull until the moment those things become life and death. Which journeyman may work on a Sunday, which timber grades are fit for rafters, how a parson repairs a leaking chancel roof when pews are full, all tedious, all essential. Those same men will be asked by daylight to count losses and to authorize repairs that must now be reckoned in streets rather than roofs. But that is for later. Now, in the early dark, before dawn on Sunday, the fire has mastered the lower lanes and is trying the upper ones, and the city breathes more smoke than air. You watch people carry modest wealth into the open. Bales are stacked in churchyards because a church, by habit, feels like a safe place. You notice how quickly the sanctuaries fill, not just with goods, but with plans. People agree to meet by certain stones at certain times if separated. They teach their children a small verse of instruction as they walk. If you are lost, stand in the open, do not run into a court. They wrap their bed linens around shoulders as much for protection as warmth, a barrier against hot dust and soft, falling ash. Amid the carefulness, you hear arguments that do not stop even in a crisis. Whose responsibility this was, how a neighbor's carelessness should have been noticed. The city is held together by many cords: duty, debt, dislike, friendship, guild oath, and parish tithe. And on a night like this, every cord is visible. When dawn begins to dilute the dark, the map of the fire reveals its ambition. You can trace its course toward the markets and along the wharves. You can see projected in people's faces fear for landmarks that are not just buildings but anchors in personal time. A church is not only where one prays, it is where one married, where one held a candle near a child's baptismal font, where one sat at the end of a pew, pretending not to count the slow, necessary coins set aside for charity. A guild hall is where one's father's name is written on a panel. A shop is where one learned an art with hands. The fire threatens all these kinds of memory. You watch some men grow practical in the face of it, and others abstract. Some focus on a single chest as if it contains all their life, while others cannot stop scanning the skyline as if they might shout the flames down by confidence. In the lanes that slope toward the river, carts tangle. You would think a city knows how to move its goods, but the city did not plan for this traffic. Oxen balk at heat, wheels bite into softening tar, and ruts that dust turned into plaster months ago. The cry of Carmen rises, equal parts command and plea. In the push to leave, people pack too much and then discard, the streets becoming islands of objects that mattered until they did not. A chest of drawers stands upright in the middle of a lane as if it had grown there, full of folded shirts, while its owner argues with a neighbor about space on a cart. Children sit on bundles like sentinels. An old man refuses to leave his threshold, gripping the door jamb as if it were the last honest thing in the world, until two younger men lift him with more kindness than strength and carry him toward the river, cursing him softly so as not to frighten him. The city's officers move in loops. You see one man with a halberd telling the same instruction to 3 parishes because parishes are jealous, and none will act simply because another has. Pull down here, leave that, make a gap there. The orders are drawn in air, pointed fingers creating maps that do not survive 2 bends in the street. No one has a complete view because the vantage points that might have given one are themselves becoming dangerous. A tower might be a watch if its timbers hold. If they do not, it will be a beacon in a way no one wants. The wind remains steady, east to west, making the city's slope toward the river part of the fire's design rather than a hindrance. Every plan must account for hazards that by day are conveniences, the market's shelters, the arcades, the sheds that carry good building practices through bad weather, now all act as tinder. You feel the oddness of time during such a night. Minutes stretch. The bell strikes once and you think it has been an hour. Then, strangely, an hour passes and you do not notice because so much is crammed into it. A wall falls, a child is found, a bucket line reorganizes around a collapsed stair, a rumor runs through the crowd that the king himself is coming to see, and then another rumor says that soldiers will clear the streets, and then a third that gunpowder will be used and that no one is safe. London thrives on rumor at the best of times. At the worst of times, rumor is a tool and a toxin. It galvanizes people and tramples them. It carries fear faster than fire ever could. Somewhere before full morning, you stand at a corner where the fire's movement can be seen as if on a board. You grasp, perhaps for the first time, that the city's typical calm tools, buckets, hooks, parish authority, are not enough at the present scale. You watch the face of a man with the responsibility to say so harden, not with arrogance, but with acceptance of costly necessity. He does not love gunpowder. He does not love tearing down. He will be judged. He knows this, and still he sends for powder. The decision takes only a few words to express and hours to enact, and in those hours, the fire continues to redraw the map. When the light strengthens, you count again the churches as if their towers were a tally of what remains. The tally is not comforting. Smoke obscures, flame outlines in grotesque ways. A steeple that had always been a needle is now a torch from within, and when it falls with a noise that is both wood and bell, a crash and a metallic scream. Sound has a different grammar on such a day. It is less articulate and more decisive. People stop speaking when a beam gives way. They open their mouths and say nothing, because the sound that replaces speech is the body's instinctive knowledge of gravity and heat asserting itself. By noon, the fire that began as a mistake in a narrow lane is no longer a mistake, but a condition. Londoners adjust in increments. One imagines how to pack a cart better. Another learns that carrying 2 small buckets is faster than 1 heavy one. A third figures out that a wet cloak is worth the discomfort if it keeps a spark from finding the crook of an elbow. In the making of these small, almost domestic strategies, you see something sturdy. The city's survival is not only in the decisions of officers, but in the dozen decisions per minute of ordinary people. It is the kind of stamina that never makes history, books with names and dates, but becomes a quiet tribute paid in things left unsaid, the shared bread on a curb, the hand on a shoulder, the refusal to take a neighbour's last space on a plank, and still the wind blows from the east as if appointed to do so. You understand that the first day's work will only decide the second day's battlefield. The night in Pudding Lane became a morning along the wharves, and the day threatens to become an afternoon of markets and lanes that sell things no one can imagine needing in a city that is suddenly a camp. For now, you breathe smoke that tastes of oak and paint and pitch and linen. You look up the slope again toward the larger city, where landmarks you have always taken for granted are no longer merely places, but questions. How far can a city burn and be the same city when the flames relent? Where does the boundary between loss and reinvention lie, and when will someone with sufficient authority stand still long enough to plant that boundary in the ground? By the time the Sunday's sun has properly risen, the city is awake to a long, uncooperative day. You measure it in the way smoke sorts itself into distinct colors, some pale as breath over water, some brown as cured leather, some black as ink. Each tone announces the burning of a different trade. You know without being told that darker smoke belongs to tar and oil and resin, that paler smoke is from dry timber, and shelving, that grey, heavy smoke with an odd taste suggests wool, linen, or hair. The senses become instruments, and you use them to take bearings as surely as a sailor uses a compass. To your left, toward the river, the wharves still service the water with men and loads, but their usefulness is at war with their vulnerability. Long, low sheds hold barrels and bales that have no love of flame, and the wind that runs in from the east treats that line of convenience as a fuse. All morning, orders and counter-orders pass through narrow lanes and out to wider thoroughfares, changing shape with every retelling. "Pull down here," the instruction says, but the finger that points moves a few yards with each new mouth that repeats it. The Lord Mayor is sent for because the city expects that decisions with costs must have a name under them, and you see the cost everywhere, the jaw set hard while a hook bites into a neighbor's lintel, the long seconds of delay while a rope is passed through a window, the carpenter's small nod before an axle turns under the weight of a joist dragged from its dwelling. Hesitation is not only a fear of blame, though blame is a heavy coin in any city's purse. Hesitation comes also from the stubborn human wish to save two things at once when you can only save one. A man looks up at his eaves and down at a chest of tools, and the tools win because they will feed him after the eaves are gone. Another looks at a shutter and a ledger, and chooses the ledger because numbers can rebuild what planks once built. You notice, as the heat sharpens, that the rhythms of work begin to change. In the bucket lines, women who have always carried water know the quickest way to make a rhythm that can last, and they sing under their breath to keep time while children step in to fill the gaps when a man staggers. The smell of singed hair appears and then fades as people learn how close is too close. Cloth becomes armor. The draper's stocks, torn down and wetted, are draped over shoulders and heads, not to show rank, but to create a barrier between skin and sparks. Doorways become the edges of miniature economies. A man takes a few coins to watch a pile while its owner runs back for another load. An old woman hands out cups of ale to those on the line in exchange for the promise of help moving her trunk later. The city's virtues, bargain, promise, forbearance, are used in ways that have no entry in any book but become binding simply because everyone can see who is keeping faith. Toward midday, you see signs that the ordinary tools will fail at scale. The iron hooks, reliable for a single house in ordinary times, seem feeble when the wind lays pressure across blocks as if the city were a single roof to be lifted. Wooden water mains, which during calmer days seem ingenious, a network of hollowed timbers sewing house to house with a hidden thread, offer little when pumps start to draw air rather than water. You remember the drought that parched gardens and turned soil from sponge to ceramic. That dryness now returns the favor to the flame. The gap that might have held if cut at dawn now seems too narrow. A leaning facade carries the fire's breath across it like a bridge. Those who have authority to reach for powder feel the scales tipping. The decision when it comes is not shouted, it is carried lip to ear, with a grimness that matches the gravity of using the same substance that saves ships and walls to erase, homes and shops. With powder comes coordination, and with coordination comes the need for steadier hands. You find your way to a corner where soldiers, sailors, and civilians are working together with a peculiar quietness, the kind that means each person is attending to what he knows best. One sets a charge under a stair, another sands a fuse, a third clears the approach so that falling beams will not trap rescuers. The first concussion shocks even those who expected it. It is a new sound in streets that have known rattle and creak and clang, but not this heavy punctuation. The air learns the new grammar. Dust leaps. Birds spring into flight and then seem to vanish into the thickening haze. After the blast comes a new wall of heat, as if the fire were surprised into eagerness by the offering of fresh timber, broken and tumbled, so that every part of it is ready to breathe. The parish lines, normally invisible until a tithing day, are made abrupt by different speeds of decision and styles of leadership. In one parish, the beadle carries himself like a small general, his voice clipped but not cruel, assigning the strongest to the most dangerous pulls and the elders to the measures and watching. In another, the officers are hesitant, and you can see the way the crowd loses confidence as instruction fails to come. People stray where people should not stray, doing small, brave things in the wrong places, fetching a moment's glory and a lifetime's regret in the same breath. You fix your eyes on the places where steady leadership shows itself, and you plant your feet there because steadiness is a commodity rarer than water. Along the waterfront, the hazards multiply. Hemp, tar, and pitch do their easy work. There, behavior on fire known to everyone who has ever watched a boat's seams be sealed in more peaceful seasons. Barrels pop, hoops spring. The sound is percussive and mechanical, like instruments learning to play without a conductor. There is a moment when a rolling cask, blackened and smoking, becomes a thing of humor even under duress, chasing a dozen men who try to stop it with hooks and then leap away when the heat tells them they were too bold. Such moments are small, but they give the body permission to breathe. Somewhere near, a barge receives goods, and you see the knowledge of the river at work, the placement of weight so that the boat does not list, the spacing of bales so that a spark falling from above cannot find a bed between them. The onlookers warned away from standing in the gap where a misstep could put them between quay and piling and draw them under with a speed that does not respect bravery. The afternoon wears on into a kind of stubborn sameness that you understand. As both good and bad, it is good because the line holds here and there. The flames, encouraged by the wind, still do not manage certain leaps where open spaces and rough ground give defenders a chance. It is bad because sameness, when you are tired, saps morale. People want progress, and when progress looks like simply preventing a thing from growing, they feel cheated. You notice how quickly the city invents new measures for success. A churchyard. Held for an hour, a row of sheds collapsed before they could catch, a lane cleared of carts so that water might pass. None of these would count as victory in a ledger, but they become the currency of endurance. In one square, workers pull planks from scaffolds to use as ramps and levers, and you remember how often the city borrows from one trade to serve another, under stress. A mason's brace becomes a fireman's pry. A cooper's hoop becomes a hook's collar. A brewer's carts fetch people and then fetch water because the wheels are strong and the horses are trained to pull without panicking. As evening returns, the wind does not. It continues from the east with the same sharp insistence that injured you in the morning. You begin to realize that the fire's map for Monday is already being drawn in the distances it has covered Sunday. It leans toward the west and north into denser neighborhoods and toward more prestigious addresses. Money, which always believed itself insulated by thicker walls and more servants, will learn that value cannot buy wind nor negotiate with ember. Yet you see that wealth still matters in a limited, useful way. A larger household produces more. Hands, more carts, more buckets, more chances that someone among them knows which joist to cut and which to brace. The poor, more practiced in sudden removal because life pushes them from one lodging to another, are quicker at sorting between trifles and irreplaceables. They keep their wits by use, the wealthy keep them by delegation. Both strategies give the city something like a spine. Night again makes the fire's movement theatrical. You stand in a place where streets converge, and the scene draws itself in clear silhouette. Figures outlined in orange, faces lit from below like lanterns, the slow snowfall of ash, turning cloaks and hats, the same color, as old stone. You learn, and knew the way sound misleads when flame is near. A crash you think is close turns out to be a block away, and a shout that sounds distant is a man at your elbow whose lips move but whose voice the roar has eaten. People who know each other by daylight now must recognize each other by gait. By the way, a shoulder dips under a burden by the pattern of a cap's brim. Work continues because stopping would be a choice you have to make, and choosing to stop feels like a moral failure even when arms shake and knees say enough. Somewhere in the confusion, arguments about cause and blame sharpen because blame feels like a handle on a thing that has no other handle. You hear the foreigner accused because he is foreign, the careless because his trade has hazards, the negligent because someone remembers a time he was negligent in some small unrelated matter. Rumor puts names into the smoke and then erases them. You force yourself to attend instead to the knowable. The wind is from the east. The buildings lean. Water is scarce. The time for permission passed while a dozen decisions were waiting for signatures. Now the decisions are made by those with powder in their hands and iron on their shoulders, and the city must tolerate their rough kindness. You think of how, in calmer times, the same men are chided for arrogance, and you wonder whether the city will remember this night with gratitude or only with bitterness at losses that could not be spared. Near midnight, you find yourself at a corner where the line is about to be forced back. The gap prepared with powder is nearly ready, but not yet. You can feel the impatience of flame, like an animal testing a fence. Every face looks up the street, counting in silence the time between the last instruction and the spark that will run along the fuse. When the charge goes, the relief is physical, a release of breath you did not know you were holding. The falling front of a house makes a sound like water pouring beads on a drum, a tinkling as glass has its say, and then is done. Behind the gap, men push forward with poles to pull smouldering fragments free so that they cannot become bridges. For a half hour, perhaps less, time seems to pause, as if the fire cannot quite believe this bit of deliberate absence in its path. Then the wind remembers its duty and embers fly, and everyone learns again that a break is only a reprieve until the next one is cut. By the small hours you see lines of people sleeping sitting up, backs against churchyard walls, chins on chests, hands still wrapped in cloths blistered by heat. Sleep comes as a strategy, a turn-based game where one set of bodies yields to another so that the line never ceases. A woman takes a child in her lap, and you witness a ritual as old as cities, the negotiation between fear and exhaustion. The child cries without tears, too dry for them, and then breathes in the measured way that means surrender to necessary rest. You notice how even now the courtesy of space persists. People leave room near gates for those still moving. They keep hands-off packages they could easily steal. The fear that the city will become savage in crisis does not find support in your eyes. Instead, you see a decency that looks like habit because that is what it is. Decency is learned as surely as any craft, and today it is practiced without any audience fit to reward it. When dawn comes for Monday, the city will count losses in new unit. Churches taken, markets compromised, guild halls threatened, whole parishes that look less like neighborhoods than like quarry faces where walls show their insides to the light. You brace for the tally because numbers, once spoken, alter the work. Numbers are political. Numbers feed argument. Numbers justify brave orders and justify the refusal to obey them. You wonder if a day can be saved by refusing to count too soon. But someone, somewhere, is already making a list. You find yourself asking a question you would rather not ask. If powder and courage and lines of weary people cannot outpace wind and timber, what else is left to try? And will the city recognize the next necessary cruelty quickly enough to matter? You enter Monday with your senses tuned to a narrow band between endurance and accident. The new day brings no miracle in the sky. The wind persists with its decided push, as if set by a hand that does not tire. You gauge the city's pulse at the points where power accumulates, the river stairs where boats now serve as lifelines, the lanes leading west where carts are no longer trading instruments but caravans, the open fields to the north and west, where household goods are being arranged as if to form new parishes made of trunks and kettles and half-scorched chairs. At every locus you watch ordinary skill trying to shoulder an extraordinary load. Watermen who once haggled over fares now bargain over the order in which families board. Carmen who knew every rut on the market roads now memorize routes that snake between burning corners and already fallen walls. Pastors accustomed to shepherding souls are shepherding packets of bread and rolls of canvas and reminding panicked men that a name written on a parcel will matter tomorrow. By mid-morning, word travels of a distinct kind of loss, not only homes and shops, but towers, whose bells had always sounded like the city's consent to the hour. You feel that loss in your bones because bells measure more than time. They measure belonging. When a steeple takes flame from within, the sight cancels older habits of belief. You know by doctrine and practice that stone should resist, that thick walls should hold, but your eyes tell you that scaffolding and oiled timbers and the stored accumulations of centuries create a different physics. Long before the public admits it, craftsmen seeing the first signs understand what is coming. The heat seeks the joints as cleverly as water ever did, exploring the seams where materials disagree. Lead, as it softens, teaches a childlike lesson in gravity that no one forgets. It runs where it will, a bright thread in a dark weave, and cools into a rippled pledge that it once climbed higher. The midday's work is a set of blunt instruments wielded with respect and fear. Powder is no longer a rumor, it is a place on a plan. You notice that plans feel strange on the tongue because the city's usual plans involve ink and argument rather than fuses and timings. Voices that once rang loud in committee rooms now lower in the street, not because authority is shy, but because clarity is best kept close when the enemy is the air. Demolition gains a cadence you can predict: clear, place, withdraw, and wait. Retreats and advances take place on the scale of houses and sheds, not armies, but the principles are nearly the same. If the line holds here, the next block can be considered. If not, you return to safety and draw the map again with char and ash. You find yourself respecting the city's quick adaptation to a new topography, one that changes hour by hour with every collapse and every successful break. Through Monday afternoon, your path crosses again and again with groups of neighbors who have turned themselves into committees with work rather than votes. Here is a circle deciding which 3 pieces from a stack must go to the field and which can remain as bait for the flames. There is a knot of men staring at a gut escape, wondering if a particular downspout could be transformed into a sluice for water delivered from a pump 2 doors away. Children weave between them with messages and mugs and small knives used to cut endless lengths of cord. Somewhere a woman, her apron grey with dust, stands at what used to be her gate, ladling broth from a pot that found its way there because someone remembered to grab it after the kettle. The fire produces no heroes as poems define them, but it produces 1,000 acts of stubborn upkeep that amount to a way of saying that the city is not yet willing to give itself over to disaster without asking a price in time and weariness and wit. Evening on Monday confirms what the morning guessed. Landmarks you never doubted are now signals of defeat as well as rallying points. Along one westward street, heat from blocks away makes your cheeks sting. You understand it as a mapped line, a frontier moving, and everywhere you look, men think in that same mapping way. The habitual rivalries of parishes begin to fall away, because the distinction between one set of lanes and another loses its comfort. Men drawn from the river work alongside men from the city's northern wards, and someone remembers, as they exchange names, how recently they shouted at each other about the price of fish. Under duress, grudges do not disappear. They go quiet, as if instructed by tired bodies to wait their turn. Night's second act for Monday brings a scene you will not forget. Great buildings that symbolize tenure, community and doctrine taking on the glow from within that means not only that they are burning, but that they are teaching every onlooker a painful lesson. Roofs designed to shed rain gather fire at their ridges, vaults built to hold voices now hold gasps and the tearing roar of 1,000 combustions. When walls fall, the wind takes embers into the mouths of lanes that had been kept clear with such care that the failure feels like betrayal. It is not, in truth. It is the consequence of a design which made beauty from timber and closeness and a social fabric woven very tight. You stand near a group of men frozen by the sight, and you remember how they argued for days over a shipment of timber grades, arguing about tiny knots and barely visible flaws, and you know that the habits of care that dominated those arguments now are being applied to gaps and charges and the persuasion of exhausted neighbors to leave before a final beam groans. By early Tuesday, after a night that does not feel like a night at all, you begin to notice subtle changes in tone. The wind, though persistent, plays with small variations. A lull holds a few minutes longer than the last. A flag on a pole stirs differently, and a set of sparks that might have crossed a narrow lane quarrel in the air and lose courage. Those who work closest to the line see it, and their faces show something like guarded hope. The cause of powdermen, more practiced now, cut breaks in a rhythm that makes sense to onlookers. Buckets are placed where buckets should be, and suddenly water feels like it can be made to count again. Exhaustion still hangs from every shoulder, but habit has created a substructure that allows for relief without collapse. You understand that on Tuesday the fight is less about discovering tools than about refusing to lose the ground that might be held. In the fields to the north, the city's possessions have settled into an improvised order. A man sits on a chest, with a ledger open across his knees. He is not writing accounts for business. He is making a list of what remains and a list of those to whom he owes debts that will matter when Flame cannot call in the loan first. He looks up when a woman asks whether placing her bundle near his might protect both, and he makes the smallest of nods, and somehow that nod becomes a pact. Children make perimeters out of pebbles for fun, and then maintain them with fierce seriousness, as if marking a new parish boundary. Up in the distance, you can see strings hung between poles, and you know without going that some of them carry washed cloth laid out, because even now someone thinks of free, clean water as a gift from the morning that could be used and then folded and then made into a fresh start. Tuesday afternoon brings one revelation of scale, and it is not happy. The city that is burning is not merely your street and the next, nor a market and a set of trades, but a web whose strands extend farther than your feet can carry you in an hour. The talk of the line becomes less personal and more topographic. There is comfort in decisions that feel properly large. The use of powder here, the holding of a Broadway there, the clearing of a bridgehead, it sounds like strategy not only in name, but in success. You hear, too, the names of leaders who have worn authority well enough to be obeyed without resentment. In a crisis, people make their judgments very quickly and then hold to them stubbornly. When a voice with proven steadiness says now, the body obeys. In the evening, a shift in the weather finally gives you a small advantage that feels larger than it is. The wind pauses, not entirely, but enough that embers begin to fall short of their ambitions. A charge set at the right angle does more work. A hook bites and holds because hands do not fear that a fresh sheet of flame will lick across the alley before they finish the pull. In those pauses, the city seems to inhale something like memory. People look at each other with a coolness returning to their eyes, and the familiar courtesy of a nod or a short word comes back without the pressure of panic. With that, other parts of life resume in miniature. Someone tunes a viol haltingly and then stops because the strings have stretched in the heat. Another writes a row of names on the wall of a yard, a family's roll call to be checked at dawn. The recapture of habit is fragile, and no one pronounces it as victory. They use it like a tool, quietly. Wednesday morning presents wreckage without surprise. Where there had been flame, there are now beds of coals and pockets of heat that wait under deceptive skins of ash. The danger now, you learn, is different. It is not the racing line, but the sullen persistence of small fires eager for an unattended hour. The bucket lines change their route. The hooks look for beams that are not yet fallen, but are empty of purpose, and can be brought down to prevent the kind of random flare that would injure tired men and women doing the dull work of watching. This is when the city's true temperament shows itself. Grand gestures are less useful than vigilance. The rhythm becomes counting, checking, calling out the same notes. Here, safe; there, still smoking. This one cooled, that one too hot, still. People who had felt helpless for 3 days feel effective again because the scale of the work meets the scale of their reach. By Wednesday afternoon, you see edges, and edges are what cities need to make sense of themselves. The fire has a front you can point to, and behind that front is an irregular country of half streets, truncated alleys, foundations drawn like maps on the ground. A child asks where his room went, and someone, pitying, traces on the air the height of a vanished ceiling, and draws a box with their hands to show where a bed had stood. The child nods and accepts the answer because acceptance is, for children, a sort of craft learned from watching adults make do. The adults, for their part, accept too, because acceptance now delivers energy toward tasks rather than toward the inconsolable. The questions you hear change. They are no longer, how far will it go, but when can we return, and what must be built first? On Thursday, the city names the changed condition with the modest words it prefers: under control. Control is not a victory banner, it is a return to arithmetic. Men walk lines with rods and chalk, marking hazards and assigning crews. Women, eyes stinging less now, sort bundles with a bored efficiency that hides their relief. Tools are counted and returned to the hands they came from. The city's institutions, stunned but still present, begin to ask for reports. It is in this bustle that the first arguments about what was done and not done stir again, and you, breathing more cleanly, realize those arguments will be the next season's weather. There will be talk of blame and talk of foresight and talk of how to make a city that cannot do this again. You stand with your hands on your hips and you understand that while the flames have taught one set of lessons, paper will teach the rest. And then at last, there is a kind of quiet. It is not the quiet of peace. Too many things creak and settle, too many stones tick as they cool. But it is the quiet of a body no longer in crisis. People sleep in longer stretches. Someone laughs and does not notice that he has laughed until others grin because their faces have not shaped themselves that way in days. Children kick at clinkers with interest instead of dread. A cat returns, singed but imperious, and walks the low wall of what used to be a garden as if it were normal to survey a country made of lengths and angles without walls to hold them together. The sight of a pot set over a fire that is comfortable, contained, and intended makes you want to sit on a stone and watch steam rise simply to remind yourself that this is what fire was supposed to be. As the smoke thins, the city's heart shows itself as a palimpsest of scars and decisions waiting. You see the foundations of houses like ribs. You see lines where streets once bent and now could be made to straighten if someone is willing to argue for straightness over habit. There is talk, in more than one corner, of using this ruin as a chance to do in weeks what committees could not settle in years: widen lanes, regulate materials, redraw difficult corners, insist that timber give way to brick and stone in ways that will cost much now and save later. You listen, and you know that every vision will meet the resistance of memory and money and custom, yet, standing in the open where once you had to turn sideways to pass a neighbor, you wonder whether the city can bear to rebuild the exact shape of what failed. The answer is not given here, in the ash. It will be sought in rooms that do not yet exist, around tables made in shops not yet rebuilt, by men and women whose hands are still raw, from carrying and tearing and wiping heat from their eyes. When you at last leave the most damaged wards and step into a district spared by wind, you feel the shock that such boundaries always deliver. Here, a street looks as it did last week. Here, a vendor calls a price as if to prove continuity. Here, a lintel holds a sprig of herbs to sweeten a doorway. You are reminded that even disasters choose their maps with a logic that is not moral. The spared did not deserve saving more than the burned deserved ruin. If there is justice to be done, it will not be in these lines, but in how the city decides to carry the burden of those whose homes are now rooms under the sky. You think of the makeshift arrangements in fields, of the patient rolls of names, of the small compacts of mutual care, and you suspect that the city's next harder task is not the securing of coals, but the maintenance of those compacts under the temptations of normal life. When Friday comes and the last stubborn hearths are knocked apart in structures that cannot be trusted to keep even a vigil flame, a phrase begins to circulate: the fire is over. It is true in one way and false in another. Over here means only that the visible enemy has been made to step back and leave people to themselves. The other fires, of argument, of planning, of recrimination, of reform, now take their turn, and you will be called to attend to them with the same stamina, if not the same urgency. As you turn for home, or for the field that pretends to be a home, you draw a breath that tastes clean enough to permit looking forward. The question that forms is simple and enormous, one the city will spend months and years answering in words, in stone, and in habits, in choosing what to rebuild and how to rebuild it. What will London decide it wants to be, and will it have the patience to become that thing without forgetting why it must change at all? You begin the second story not with flame, but with tools, because that is what people reach for when a city begins to test its joints. You feel the handles first, the worn wood of buckets polished by years of palms, the pebbled leather stiff. With old soap, the iron rings that clink with a sound you could recognize blindfolded. A leather bucket is not merely an object, it is a promise folded into a circle. It hangs by the door, as surely as a coat hangs on a peg, stamped with an owner's initials, sometimes with a parish mark, sometimes with a date that outlasts the hand that first lifted it. In ordinary time, you might think of it as a small domestic thing. On a Sunday that turns into a siege, it becomes a unit of accounting for human endurance. You learn the rhythm of a bucket line by doing rather than watching. The river is the city's lung, inhaling and exhaling water with the tide. You stand where stairs notch the bank, and you join a chain that translates the river's pulse into action. The first hands are wet always, the cold climbing wrists, sleeves rolled and still not dry. The middle hands move by counting and by eye. The last hands pour where someone points at a smouldering lintel, at a door breathing fire, at a plank that white smokes like breath on winter air. The pressure to pour where flame shows is strong, and yet you learn to soak what has not yet brightened, to make a wet edge where the fire's curiosity will meet inconvenience. That is what you are taught by someone who speaks without ceremony. Do not fight the whole fire, make it choose a harder path. Next come the hooks, the most bluntly honest tools the city possesses. You feel their weight as you would the heft of a verdict. Iron teeth curve cruelly at the end of long poles, sometimes jointed so they can be lengthened in a hurry. In normal times, the hooks are used to take down what is already dangerous, a loose gable, a chimney whose mortar has failed, a facade that leans like a tired man. On a night when hesitation costs blocks, the hooks are used to commit what feels like a sin for the sake of a larger good. You discover how a dozen shoulders can become a single intention. The pole bows, the hook bites. The wall resists, then trembles, then yields. The yielding has a language you learn quickly, a buzz through wood as joints complain, a crack as a beam stops arguing, the breath-sucking pause as people step back in unison to avoid the reach of a falling story. There are squirts too, hand-pumped, devices with brass nozzles and cylinders that glint even in soot. They are useful at close quarters when a person can crouch and aim into the mouth of a fire on the ground. They are not grand engines, not the larger pumps that in later years will take pride of place, but they are familiar to parish work crews. You learn how they must be fed, as a hearth is fed, primed, pumped, attended, and always close to a source of water. When the larger pumps, boxy, heavy, pulled by men with ropes and by horses that dislike the heat, arrive from yards where they are stored, you discover that the city kept more than you knew for a rainy day that is not rainy at all. The engines have cisterns that must be filled and refilled. They throw a good stream if the pumpers can keep a cadence, and so the engines become little theatres of effort. Men lean into the bars. A boy cries, "Faster," until someone gives him another job. The hosman listens for the slap of the pulse in the canvas and directs the spray with the attention of a painter. All this, you realize, functions within a lattice of custom called the parish. The parish is not just a church and a priest. It is a way of being together that includes beadles with staves and a knowledge of who owes what to whom when the bell clangs an alarm. You watch beadles count bodies with their eyes, assigning lines and reliefs. You watch constables ask for keys to yards, to sheds, to stores of tools kept in common. You recognize the social fabric as a set of agreements, some written down and others spoken over bread and ale. On this Sunday, turned Monday, you feel the value of that fabric when things move without a leader's having to shout, but you also feel its limits when the habit of asking permission slows actions that need a quicker consent. That is where authority enters the picture as a human figure rather than a concept. The Lord Mayor, weary-eyed, is summoned not just to give orders but to put his name to losses. He is carried in rumour, and then he appears in a lane where men with hooks have stopped to ask whether they should bring down a house that has not yet caught. The faces around him are a mixture of relief and anxiety. In them you read the wish all cities harbor in crisis, that the person who can be blamed later will grant permission now. The Lord Mayor looks at the wind, then at the sky, then at the crowd, and hesitates. It is not weakness. It is the weight of custom that tells him a house is a self, that a man's shop is his biography, that pulling it down without a writ is an offence that will be remembered longer than the night. The moment stretches, brittle. When he finally nods, relief is an exhale you feel in the soles of your feet. The decision to use powder is a different kind of permission. Powder is not an accident in a flame, it is fire made articulate by chemistry and intention. You know it from celebrations and from war stories carried home by sailors and soldiers. In the tight-packed lanes, powder is both hope and hazard. You learn quickly that powder needs hierarchy. It must be handled by men who trust each other's touch, laid by hands that have steadiness enough to measure and daring enough to approach, where the heat hums like a hive. The first charges are small, exploratory, like the city pressing a finger against a tooth to see which one aches. When a wall goes down with a concussive thud and makes a space out of stubbornness, hands reach automatically to drag the debris into shapes that will not invite the fire to step across. It is work with a harsh logic, and as you repeat it half a dozen times you realize you are learning a craft at speed. While the tools advance, another machine moves among them, one made not of wood or iron, but of people. The London trained bands, the city's militia, gather under their officers, wearing coats that would be at home on a drill field rather than in an alley thick with soot. They bring organization, they bring discipline that can be transplanted from the practice ground to a falling street. Their sergeants call the pace and set pickets that keep spectators from pushing into danger or thieves from making opportunity out of distraction. You do not see many thieves, though. You see more fear of them than examples. The trained bands also serve as couriers for orders. They carry the king's intention when the king appears in person, which he does when rumor becomes reality. And you see royal color through smoke, a sober coat, a face you have only seen engraved, now streaked with ash. That royal presence is not theatrical. It is decisiveness given legs. The king does what the mayor hesitated to do. He calls for powder, as a principle rather than an exception, and he sends for his brother, the Duke of York, to oversee the work. The Duke moves among the men not with the arrogance you feared, but with the practical set of someone used to ships and their sudden needs. He listens to a carpenter with hair singed and hears in the man's few words the shape of a plan, and then he repeats the plan in a voice that makes people move. You take from that the lesson cities relearn in crises, that legitimacy flows from steadiness, and that steadiness speaks in instructions that can be obeyed at once. Meanwhile, the small area where you stand is a miniature of the larger city. On your right, a line of children carry earthenware pitchers and mugs and oddities pressed into service as water vessels because buckets are too heavy for their wrists. On your left, a pair of elderly men hold a rope taut as a barrier and speak their names to every person who approaches, not because names are necessary in the moment, but because names enforce civility. Behind you, a woman kneels with a cloth to tie around the mouth of a child whose cough will not abate. In front of you, powder men step back as the fuse runs, and then the wall shudders as if relieved to be falling. The charge does not only remove wood and plaster, it removes excuses. When the debris clears, people talk less about if and more about next. Water supply sits at the center of every thought you have. The new river's conduits, the wooden mains that run like veins. Beneath the streets, the parish pumps, they are all a fraction of what you wish for, under a sky that greys with heat. You feel the pity of drought. You remember the way gardens' earth went to dust weeks ago, the way a boot left a print deeper than it should. The mains, hollowed elm joined end to end, did what they could in calm years. In this year, the flow drops to sulks and spits when the pumps are asked to offer too much. You watch men lift the tops off conduits to scoop straight from the channels, creating little water places where none existed before, using every bucket and pail and pan to carry the trickle to where it might blunt an ember's curiosity. The command habit of the city is visible in the devices people use for anything but commands: chalk and boards, bits of slate, notches cut in the lintel of a shop that is about to become a gap. A man tallies how many pulls per minute a line can sustain before arms cramp. Another sketches the shape of a facade and marks with a cross the beam that, if cut, will let the rest come down without fighting. These are dull skills in dull times: accounting, measurement, estimation. And now they are the difference between a glove of fire wrapping a block and a block being reduced on purpose in a way that confuses the flame. As Monday advances, you notice the complex ethics of retreat. Some streets are lost despite heroics. The admission is not defeat, it is the decision to find a new line. You hear men who have worked until their hands bleed give way to those who have rested an hour and now step forward, not to become heroes, but to keep the cadence. The parish border matters less. The work group matters more. People drift to where they are known, and being known can be used with the least explanation. This is banal and beautiful at once. The city learning to be itself under stress by leaning on relationships that existed before the stress. Ordinary life sneaks into the edges of catastrophe because ordinary life insists. A baker makes flatbread on a sheet of tin warmed by coals pulled safely aside, and the smell makes everyone realize how long it has been since eating felt like eating. A seamstress takes a needle to a split hose because burned canvas is still cloth, and a needle still understands it. A carman picks a splinter out of a horse's flank with a tenderness that sounds like prayer. You take a cup of small beer from a barrel moved into the lee of a wall that no longer stands, and you feel the relief run through your limbs. The cup is a gesture that says you belong, that even now the exchange of small comforts has value. As dusk draws back in, you hear the debate over night work return with new terms. The argument is sobriety itself. In darkness, coordination bails, and mistakes are paid for in breath and bone. But the counter-argument is equally sober. The fire loves the night's drafts, and if the lines halt entirely, an advantage won after a day's brutality will be lost before cockcrow. The compromise is what compromises often are: uneasy. Work continues in places where the lines are broad and the risks are known. It pauses in the tight turns where a falling ember or a misjudged pull could make a new disaster inside the old. Through it all, you keep registering the same truth. Authority in a city is never only the person with the sash or the signet. Authority is also a woman who knows the names of 20 neighbors and uses those names to persuade them to move their bundles 2 yards this way and not that. A lad of 15 who can swing a hook clean because he learned to scull a boat against the ebb. An old man who has spent a lifetime listening to wind through eaves and can tell by sound whether a roof will hold long enough to clear the room below. The dull habit of attention cultivated over years becomes contagious. You catch it from them and pass it along. Late Monday, you find yourself at a crossroads where the city's will and the wind's will seem to wrestle. A street has been opened by powder into a rough square and men decide whether to widen it still at the cost of 2 more houses that might be spared if luck is kind. The argument is calm, the way real arguments among exhausted people can be. One speaks for caution, one for boldness. You stand in the middle, aware that both speak love for the place in their way, and you feel the grimness of choices that leave scars no matter how they are made. Then the wind answers the debate with a gust that blows sparks against the eaves in question, and the decision is made without anyone claiming victory. You step back with the others as fuses are laid again, and you wonder how many of the city's future design choices will be decided by similarly impatient moments dressed as fate. When at last you sit down on a curb to lace a shoe whose leather has shrunk and cracked, the day seems to end and then start again in the same breath. A child falls asleep standing up, balanced against a parent's hip. A dog lies down on a piece of carpet and refuses to move until someone laughs and drags both carpet and dog another 10 paces. A bell rings, not an alarm this time, but the hour, as if to insist that there is still an hour to be named. You look at the faces around you, smoked, tired, odd with streaks where sweat carved clean lines in the grime, and you feel that you are part of something larger than fear and smaller than legend. It is a city's muscle remembering its work. Night arrives not as curtain, but as another tool, cloaking motions you wish to hide from the flame's sight. You see small teams moving like shadows, dropping embers from roofs with wetted brooms, tipping water into cracks, setting tiny guard fires in open spaces to deprive the larger enemy of easy meals. It is patience in 1,000 gestures, and then you hear it, a whisper of change above the roar, a small difference in the way smoke lifts from the near edges of the fire line. You narrow your eyes against the ash and ask yourself the question every person is asking in the quiet of their bones as Monday leans toward Tuesday. If ordinary tools and borrowed authority have finally given the city a grip, will that grip hold through the next turn of the wind, or will the night rewrite the map again when your back is turned? You return to the line where heat teaches every nerve a lesson in distance, and you notice that the city's understanding of itself is changing one order at a time. The old ways are still there, parish bells, beadles, constables, but they have been threaded together by something more direct, a rope of command that runs from mouths used to giving orders at sea to hands used to heaving on land. You feel it in the way the Duke of York speaks a sentence that is half map and half instruction. Here the break, there the charge, pump to this corner, clear that alley, hold for the fuse. His voice does not pound the ear, it measures. You may never have met a gentleman whose words felt so thoroughly like a plan. The plan does not cancel what the parish knows. It takes it in and adds a tempo, the way a drummer improves a march not by telling feet what they are, but by making their purpose audible. You stand again with the engines, the big wooden pumps that make a street feel like a ship under strain. You learn the trick of keeping the stroke even when your shoulders burn, because uneven pumping breaks the stream, and a broken stream is a disappointment to the person holding the nozzle, which is a disappointment that turns quickly to danger. Men swap out not because their pride gives way, but because the cadence must not. A man with a battered hat calls time in a steady count. 2 up, 2 down, 2 up, 2 down. The hosman, jaw set, sweeps left and right, wetting down places where flame wants to think about itself too much, beating the glow into a sulk that can be managed. One of the engine's wheels has a wobble you can hear. The carpenter notices and fishes a wedge from his apron and taps it into a joint as if correcting a child's posture. You understand watching that improvisation is a pile of small salvations, each invisible, to those 10 paces away, each the thing that keeps the line from becoming rumour. On this Monday night, power comes with proximity. The king does not rule better because of his crown. He rules better because the ash on his cuff sends a message that nobody who matters will be allowed to stand at a safe distance and theorize. When he speaks to a parish officer, the officer listens, not because a court might punish him later, if he does not, but because the king is here, looking at the same fire, smelling the same burned linen, feeling the same gusts that scatter embers. The monarch's presence picks up the slack in the old system, where custom too often needed a day's worth of signatures to move a beam. You do not stop being a citizen when the king arrives. You become a citizen who can point, speak, and be heard through a chain that reaches farther than your personal acquaintance. Beside you, the militia rearranges itself the way an experienced crew does when the weather changes. The trained bands stand their posts, but they become jointed with watermen and shipwrights who, called from Deptford and the yards, have a feel for rope and for force passing through timber. A shipwright looks at a house and sees framing angles, the way he sees them in a hull. He knows where a stroke with a long-handled axe will make a wall give quietly, and where it will send a splinter, like a spear, across an alley. He knows how to pull with the wrist more than the back, so that the hook's bite deepens instead of skittering out for want of patience. You watch him swap words with a parish carpenter who is more used to floors and staircases than to rails and knees. The two meet in the middle and produce a technique neither owned alone. It is one of those dull, miraculous exchanges that leaves no monument, and all the difference. Rumours wheel and dart, and then, as a steady habit of work takes hold, they lose some of their purchase. The angry talk about saboteurs and strangers grows quieter where steady instruction makes space for attention, because attention is a full-time occupation. You cannot attend at once to a suspected malice 3 streets over and to the fuse running toward powder at your feet. The man with ash in his hair and rope burns on his hands has less room in his head for blame than the man who has done nothing but watch. The watchers have a harder time. It is a law of crowds that those who do not bear weight seek to carry certainty. You give them weight when you can, pass this bucket, hold this rope, stand there and repeat the count loud enough for the next man to hear. The difference is immediate. A task is a solvent for fear. It does not eliminate it, it dissolves enough of it to make air in the lungs. The river, as ever, is the city's other hand. Stairs that in normal times were staircases for trade and gossip now feel like the pause where life is exchanged. Boats lie in the eddies as if the river too has contrived breaks against its own current. Barges squat under loads that smell of the city's various appetites, sacks of flour, bales of cloth, bolts of rope, barrels labelled in chalk with hurried letters that will have to be rewritten later. Watermen make a calculus at every landing, how many to take now, how many to leave, in hope of another boat, whether to risk the downstream drift to a safer quay or to pull hard against the flood to place a bundle where a family will find it if paths are cut. The river's time and the fire's time wrestle, and you are reminded that a city thrives on more than one clock. In the streets away from the front, you meet a procession of everyday expertise turned to uncommon purposes. A scrivener writes names on scraps of paper that he pins to bundles with a hot needle, muttering that order stolen now will be paid back, with interest later. An apothecary ties a cloth soaked in vinegar over his nose and tells others to do the same, not because it makes breathing easier, though it does a little, but because it makes the wearer believe he has engaged the problem directly and is not merely being undone by it. A cooper volunteers his hoop to mend a broken bucket. He bends it with an affectionate violence that speaks of long practice. A farrier sharpens a hook because dull iron does not respect tired hands. The city is a machine powered by trade. Its fuel is the understatement of men and women who do not think their ordinary competence needs applause. You learn to think in materials. The fire thinks in voids, it seeks air. You must think in solids and in wetness. You wet canvas and hang it in curtains from eaves where sparks are landing. You collapse porches whose shadows invite hidey holes for embers. You shovel coals into heaps and wet them into gruel that offends even the fire's appetite. You block gaps under doors, not to keep flame out, but to keep wind from feeding flame in, understanding the difference between keeping a thing at bay and depriving it of breath. The smallest measures stick to memory. Someone shows you how to soak a broom and sweep forward rather than back, so that embers roll into wetness rather than being flicked toward feet. Someone else tells you to hold a wet blanket by its corners, not along its edge, because it will not flop and open a breathing space for sparks if a gust pulls it. By late Monday night, a map of leadership has drawn itself in your head. There are places to go when you do not know what to do, because someone there has proved capable of wanting the right things in the right order. Life before timber, timber before ledgers, ledgers before arguments about ledgers. One such place is a yard behind a wrecked house where a woman with grey in her hair runs what looks like a kitchen and is, in fact, a logistics post. She knows which engines have had their pumpers least recently rested. She knows where there is clean water. She knows which family has lost track of a child and is looking in the wrong place. Her voice keeps low. Her finger points only when needed. You fetch from her because she never sends you for something that will not be used. You remember her because tomorrow no chronicle will. In several streets, gunpowder has become a metronome. The men who lay it have faces that could be carved for a ledger of risk. Their work is measured by a chain of precautions that you accept, without conversation, because you can see in the whites of their eyes that they have already had one narrow escape and do not intend to have a second. They set fuses that burn at a rate you learn to count. They shield the powder from stray embers with wet cloth and boards set upright like hasty forts. They keep children back with a kindness that is all sternness. They do not terrify, but they do not bend. You appreciate that there are people whose manner does not invite debate when a job admits no second try. There are moments of deep confusion when two orders arrive together and cannot be both obeyed. In one such moment, you watch a line hesitate and then do the braver thing simply because the voice that gave the second order is calm. Calmness in a city fighting fire is not merely a virtue, it is a technology. It persuades arms to keep moving. When reason says, put the bucket down, it makes people toe a mark while a wall sags because somebody nearby will shout, step back at the precise second, and not a heartbeat late. Calmness spreads by nearness. You find yourself keeping it like a candle against your sternum, guarding it from drafts, and then offering its light to the nearest set of eyes when they go wide. Sometimes the fire answers with a kind of malice. That is only physics, but feels like insult. It takes a gap, loves it, feeds on the edges of it, and then leaps where you thought it could not. You see this again near a church where the tower has stood like a parent over houses, the bell silent now because its ropes have burned. The scaffolds in place for repairs begun in better weather are ladders for flame. When the tower gives, the sound includes the note of the bell that once measured dawn and dusk, and it is not only wood and iron falling, it is the thing inside you that thought certain shapes defined the place you live. When you flinch and then blink, someone beside you, older, nods because he has already accepted that maps change. Toward the hours before dawn, Monday passing into Tuesday, like a sigh through a keyhole, you feel, and you do not think you are alone in feeling it, some small difference in the air. You watch the wind the way sailors do, with narrowed eyes and a list of comparisons to last hour and the hour before that. A telltale on a broken pole flutters in a less certain way. Smoke lifts a shade higher, perhaps only because the heat is less in this stretch, but it is enough to draw a breath without tasting pitch. The powder teams make another break, and this time embers drift and fall short instead of being flung like seeds. Hope is not a shout. It is a blink, a longer exhale, a question someone asks in a low tone, like a husband talking to his wife of a difficult future. You do not say the word aloud because words have a superstition attached to them, but you work forward with a little more confidence in your feet. What the city learns by Tuesday is less about heroism and more about invariance. Fire obeys geometry and air. It is not persuaded by rhetoric. It is slowed by distance and by lack of fuel. It struggles at corners that give it no convenient route. It is confused by irregularities you create on purpose. A neat street is a perfect argument for the fire. A broken one is a mutter that it has trouble answering. You begin to see that the orders which will outlast the week are not only emergency orders barked down lanes, but, later, written orders hammered into law, widths of streets, heights of walls, materials set by rule, proximities forbidden, spaces opened, alignments fixed. For now, this knowledge is a ghost in your head, a set of hunches confirmed with every successful gap. For later, it will become measurements on a surveyor's chain and chalk lines on the raw ground. At the very last, as stars thin and the east grows suggestive rather than merely pale, you find yourself back at the engine where, for a brief hour, the stream arcs farther than it did yesterday. The pumpers grin despite their lips cracked by heat, because a change in the air has turned their work from mostly symbolic to actually effectual. Water that reached and evaporated now soaks and runs. Cloth that dried in the air before it could do its job now clings and smothers. People move not faster, they cannot, but with less of the peculiar, sinking reluctance that accompanies futility. The line holds in a way that has a different sound, less shouting, more counting, the rustle of wet cloth instead of the hiss of fresh flame. You close your eyes for a heartbeat, listening, and then open them because even now, habit fights the desire to rest. You are left with one thought, the kind that tightens in the chest because it asks for more than your body wants to give. If the city begins this day with a better grip, will it remember, once breath comes easier, how dearly that grip was purchased, and who paid for it in measures too small to be tallied on any public roll? By Tuesday morning, command feels less like a trumpet and more like a hum. You sense it in the way orders arrive, not as new instructions, but as continuations of yesterday's better guesses. The King's persistence and the Duke of York's practical. I set a pattern that ordinary officers can imitate without affectation. Look closely, decide quickly, accept the cost, move the line. You see the city adapt to the idea that leadership can be distributed without being diffuse. A beadle can take a street, a sergeant can take a block, a carpenter can be left to judge a facade, a waterman can point to the best landing. No one signs a parchment to authorize this. And yet it happens because the work would not go forward otherwise. Certain places become symbols. Temple Bar, the ceremonial gate at the western limit of the city, stands as a kind of hinge between streets, at risk and streets that must be held. Men speak its name with a concreteness that is part geography and part oath. The lanes that lead toward it, Fleet Street, the precincts around the temple, turn into the place where Powder's argument is strongest. There you witness a string of calculated destructions, each meant to deny the flames an easy path into the Inns of Court, and the broader West beyond. The sight is strange in the way a necessary betrayal is strange. You watch men with faces as serious as judges bring down houses not because they have failed, but because they are in the wrong place for the new map. The sound of explosions now blends into the day's grammar. A sentence of concussions followed by the paragraph of collapse. Near the river, the line stubbornly argues with the fire's love of warbs. Warehouses that once smelt of pepper, tobacco, resin, cloth, salt and spice now turn those scents into a mixture that makes your tongue taste of markets burned to grammar, nouns reduced to ash. Men try a new tactic, moving goods already smouldering onto rafts and shoving them into the current. It is a desperate use of the river as a kind of second storage, one that sometimes works and sometimes spreads the fire to an unlucky boat downstream. You learn that every tactic costs. The trick is to pay the smaller cost rather than the larger one, and to do it with the speed that keeps alternatives from going stale under your hands. Tuesday afternoon brings the fire to confront the fabric of institutions. Guild halls that had stored rules and customs within their panelling now store heat the way a kiln does. When a guild hall succumbs, the loss is both practical and symbolic. The men who wore livery and argued about weights and grades do not weep. They stand and watch with fists on hips, counting the seconds between the first visible breach of the roof and the rain of embers that follows. Their faces tell you that the rebuild, when it comes, will be argued as fiercely as any regulation ever was, and with the same patience that made dull deliberations bear fruit over years. The city's habit of patience feels today like a bank account you didn't know you had, drawn upon by exhaustion without going into deficit. The heart of loss is taught most starkly by the great cathedral. It had been scaffolded for repair, its fabric, stone vaults, timber roofs, arranged in a geometry that made rain a subordinate and voices grand. On Tuesday, the geometry becomes an invitation. Lead softens, timbers turn to roads for flame, and the whole becomes a lantern whose light is wrong. It is the light of stored centuries of labor giving way in a day. You stand at a distance because closeness is an offense in the face of something so off balance between reverence and physics. The fall is not a simple collapse, it is a sequence, one that men who understand structures will remember later when they draw plans that insist on new materials and new distances. You feel the lesson in your ribs. Beautiful can be fragile, venerable can be vulnerable, respected can be riven. Yet even as loss tallies itself, the other arithmetic you have been practicing begins to matter. Tuesday evening, the wind's insistence grows less tyrannical. It is not kindness, it is merely a slackening that the city treats as permission to assert itself more firmly. Breaks widen, lines straighten, not because straightness is a virtue, but because a straight line is easier to supply and to defend. The engines, given more chance to shoot without the stream breaking into mist, earn back some of the faith men had invested in them at their purchase. Hooks, less harried, bite and hold with an effectiveness that makes the grim work almost satisfying. The habit of keeping buckets ready by the door begins to reassert itself beyond the front, not as a defiance, but as a way of saying that the household, too, will take its watch. Command learns compromise in a dozen careful ways. A potent one concerns what to save and what to spend. A man petitions, cap in hand, to spare a shop that holds stock worth a year's meals if only the line can be edged a few feet. The officer shakes his head, not unkindly, and points to a roofline that makes the shop into a funnel. The man sees the shape, because shape now persuades better than argument. He swallows, nods, and takes the hook himself in the end, biting the gable by his own will, so that the house falls when the fuse pops rather than when the fire takes it uglier. Compromise is not surrender. It is a choice about timing and agency. You realize that many of the city's best decisions will be remembered as compromises made by people who refused to let the fire choose for them. Ordinary lives continue their necessary inventions. An alehouse, its signboard charred into a silhouette, shifts purpose and becomes a dispensary, not of medicine in phials, but of water, bread, and places on benches for feet to be tended. A tailor stitches a tear in the hose of a powder man, because clothing is armor and time spent mending now saves time later when a snag could send a fuse flying. A midwife takes charge of a cluster of children whose mothers are in the lines. She has a voice that can both soothe and command, and she makes the children into messengers, not because the distance they can carry words is far, but because the act of carrying steadies their breathing. You see that the city's most durable talent is to assign meaning to small acts so that they become supports instead of distractions. By Wednesday morning, quiet has a different shape. It is not the quiet of surrender, but the quiet of calculation. The fire's front is ragged where yesterday it ran smooth, and men speak in terms not of inevitabilities, but of options. The choice to clear. A street transforms into the choice to clear half and hold a bend that favors defenders. The decision to drop a facade becomes a debate about which beam gives the cleaner fall. People argue less about who failed on Sunday and more about who will watch Wednesday afternoon, so that those who worked from midnight to dawn can sleep without dreams twisting at their limbs. The city is putting back on its habits, rosters, turns, precise language, because panic has turned too expensive to maintain. The last hard push is made where the streets open to fields. North and west, where gardens and patches of grass begin to show, the fire loses appetite because fuel is thin. Men and women seize the chance. Clearings that in ordinary time are just spaces now become allies. Families form circles around their goods with a logic that echoes military camps. They place their chests and stools not just anywhere, but with cut-throughs left for buckets, and space kept for the passage of a stretcher, if one is needed. A boy looks at the pattern and beams, seeing a game. A woman looks at the same and nods, knowing that this order will be the difference between losing and keeping one more thing when the next gust comes. On Thursday, the word under control begins to pass from lips to ears. No trumpet announces it. No standard is raised. It comes hesitantly, then with a little more confidence, then with relief, so deep that it makes no sound at all. The line does not dissolve, it shrinks appropriately. People return like wading birds after a storm, testing the ground before putting weight on it. Men knock apart any standing stoves and hearths that might tempt someone to boil a pot too soon. Women go over coals that look sullen, only to find heat hiding in a corner like a child who refuses to say he is awake. The new task is drearier and demands as much attention. Guard against the afterfires, list the dangerous remains, put markers where people must not walk until a carpenter says it will not trap them. Authority gives back what it borrowed from ordinary people, and you watch how that exchange happens without speeches. The Duke of York is there less often because the tasks have scaled down to what parishes can manage. The king's visits grow shorter and more ceremonial because the danger has shrunk from regions to corners. The trained bands free more men to return to households. In their place, the beadles and constables step forward again, counting with their staves and their ledgers, resuming the older arithmetic of the city: who lives where, who needs what, who owes whom, an hour on the bucket line tomorrow, if there. House still stands and their neighbours does not. By Friday, the work is mostly caution and the first little moves of beginning again. A barber shaves a man by the light of a window frame without glass. The razors whisper, a sound that insists. The body deserves its rituals. A schoolmaster writes letters on a bit of plank for children to trace with char, not because lessons must resume at once, but because hands are quieter when they copy familiar shapes. A mason runs a finger along a stone to feel whether it has spalled, deciding if it can be used in the new wall or must be discarded. The arguments about authority, which were so hot on Sunday, cool into arguments about method, price, and schedule that will fill the weeks to come. You carry away a register of lessons that do not look like triumph, that a bucket well placed is worth as much as a speech, that a rope held by two old men can save a dozen from rushing where curiosity burns more than flame, that gunpowder, managed by hands that respect it, can be the cleanest cut where the fire would bite jagged. That command to be obeyed must look like the work and not like a picture of it. You have seen a city's confidence dented and then restored not by certainty but by the practical courage of saying, here is what we can do next. When at last people sleep through a dawn, they dream of simple things. Bell sounds that are not alarms, a loaf that smells only of bread, a sky that is merely a sky. You wake to a question you did not know you had been composing, the kind that deserves no quick answer and no rest until it finds one. After a city has learned to obey the voice that saves it, how does it teach itself to argue again, in calmer voices, without forgetting that the point of all those arguments is to keep its people alive the next time the wind holds steady from the east? You enter the weeks after the last great tongues of fire have folded into coal beds and ash, and your first impression is not grandeur, but method. The city's horizon, which had once been a staircase of timber roofs, steeples and lofts, has flattened into a landscape of foundations, stubs of walls and isolated chimneys that stand like punctuation marks in a text that has been mostly erased. Underfoot, the ground crunches, char, warped nails, roof tiles that have lost their glaze and become porous as pumice. The air, even in the mornings, still carries the faint smell of tart, wet ash, a reminder that heat lingers in pockets until a cautious hand with a bucket persuades it to let go. If you pause and listen, the old sounds, the clop of hooves, the shout of a carman are present, but there is another music now, the scrape of shovels, the clatter of bricks stacked with care, the thread-drawn voice of a clerk reading names. Fire's grammar has been replaced by the grammar of listing. In open spaces that were never meant to be open spaces, people have settled into a provisional order. Moorfields, with its marsh memory tempered by ditches and paths, is now a city of bundles. Rolls of bedding line up like small ridges. Chests sit squat and dignified as if offended by their relocation. Odd pieces of furniture, three-legged stools, a chair missing a rung, a table rubbed smooth by years of meals, have been arranged into islands of identity. If you look closely, you can see families marking the bounds of their temporary homesteads, with cords, pebbles, even chalk lines on the ground, pulled straight by a child's attentive hand. The courts and churchyards where people piled goods in the heat are now emptied of fear, but busy with negotiation. A woman trades a better place near the path for a half sack of flour. A man holds a place for a neighbour's cart for the price of a promise to stand in a line tomorrow when brick is being distributed. Markets spring up in these fields with no signs and no stalls, only the habit of price and the mathematics of scarcity. You notice that the city's real wealth, the shared understanding of how to exchange, survived unburned. Numbers reach you in fragments, streets destroyed, parishes consumed, houses levelled to foundation lines, churches that no longer hold. Bells but do hold memory like a seam holds stress. You sense that people tally partly to take control, and partly because tallies will soon shape policy. The parish, as a unit of belonging, remains intact even where the buildings do not. Its beadles and constables begin to find their flock by ink as much as by pew. Rolls are made, names are read. The simple question, "Are you here?" is asked more times in a week than in an ordinary year. You learn to appreciate the dull heroism of clerks who write through soot smudges and keep their pen nibs trimmed, who take affidavits from people whose hands still shake, who make 2 copies because paper loses its way as easily as people do. Lists become passports to relief and the future. To appear on the right line with the right description of your holding, your lease and your needs is to remain legible to the city you belong to. At the same time, you see the sketched silhouettes of the powers that will decide the city's shape, returning to their benches and tables. The king is still visible, his presence a signal that the crown intends to be seen as guardian and not merely as spectator. The city's aldermen, sobered in their black gowns, confer in rooms that smell of damp lime and wet timber. Surveyors knot cords at their belts and take chains in their hands. The work looks like 100 small errands, but the effect is large. Men accustomed to pacing distances across ships' decks now pace widths along Cheapside and King Street, taking in the feel of air across an open place and the way a corner might, if allowed, become a funnel again. You watch the careful dance of authority and habit as the city and the crown test each other's claims. There is no appetite for confrontation in the ash. There is, instead, a new appetite for distinction. What the city must do for its own governance, what the crown must do for the realm, and where both must consent because the work belongs to neither entirely. Surveying begins with a simplicity that hides its difficulty. Chains, iron, with links counted by a practiced eye, are stretched between points that someone must decide are points worth keeping. Surveyors set rods with bits of cloth so labourers know where to stand while string is pulled taut. You notice how often they crouch, not to rest, but to bring their eyes closer to the ground where the truth of slope and drain can be seen. In these moments, names that will become familiar later are simply faces bent over chalk and plumb lines. A man with a keen, noticing way of walking marks a corner and then walks it again with more attention, his mouth moving as he counts. The city's map, once grown by custom, now begins to be drawn by choice. The first choices are not grand, they are choices about thresholds and alignments. Should this street keep its old bend, which has the virtue of memory but the vice of a draught? That fed flame, should that frontage be pulled back the thickness of a cart to widen a pinch point no one loved even in ordinary times? What was once private becomes public for a stretch, then returns to private again further on, a compromise hammered out in talk that begins early and ends when lamps are lit. You hear the refrain that will dominate the coming months: speed against perfection. Speed has a good argument. People need roofs before winter presses into bones and makes sickness the city's next enemy. Perfection has a good argument. Mistakes made now will hide for a generation inside walls and then fly out again as sparks. In these arguments you hear little drama and much persistence. A clerk notes the agreed frontage in a hand that can be read. A neighbour signs with a shaky mark. A mason nods and says he can build to that line if stone arrives when promised. Stone and brick become not ideas but flows. Barges along the river carry cargoes that have urgency stamped in their weight. Brick from new clamps on the river islands and along the Kentish shore ragstone and Portland stone shipped from quarries that now run extra shifts, timber from places not yet charmed by fire horror into panic. You study the stacks, brick in hues from salmon to rust, each with a different appetite for heat, stone laid in neat courses so it can dry and be ready for the mason's hammer. The chatter among labourers turns to materials with a specificity you learn to admire. A brick that rings when struck is sound. A brick that thuds is spalled and will not be trusted for a skin that must carry weight and stand dry. Lime kilns sprout like mushrooms and smoke in a steady way that comforts because it is the smoke of making, not of loss. The new city's smell is a mixture of lime, wet mortar, fresh sawn oak, and river mud, and to you it smells like insistence. Meanwhile, you can feel the pulse of an idea with bigger bones. The possibility that this blankness could invite a cleaner geometry. In rooms with measured speech, grand plans are described, streets drawn wider than memory, avenues that radiate from public squares, sight lines that turn steeples into anchors for the eye. The seduction of an ideal map is strong, especially in minds that have always seen the city as a machine in need of tuning. You are invited to it too. Anyone who has stumbled through a cramped alley in fog has imagined it reformed by a firm hand. And yet when the plans meet the ground, they collide with the stubborn geometry of property. Land is not an abstraction. It lives as lines on deeds, as livelihoods balanced on shop fronts, as the calculations of landlords and tenants whose obligations are written in terms that make change an expensive luxury. The city discovers again a lesson it already knew, that perfect patterns fail not only because people are timid, but because good enough can feed a family faster than excellent, and families need feeding now. Out of this tug of ideal and possible comes a third way, cautious and cunning. Rather than radical overthrow, the city pursues strategic correction. Certain lanes are widened as a matter of rule. Overhanging jetties that once shaded walkers and squeezed street air into a bellows are forbidden. Building lines are set back. The cross streets that feed great thoroughfares are aligned so that carts can turn without pinching wheels. You hear talk of classes of street, and it makes sense. The longest ways with the most traffic deserve the most width, and their buildings must be limited to heights that keep air moving. Fronts must be in stone or brick, party walls thickened to particular measures, roof coverings obliged to resist catching and to shed embers. These are not ornaments of governance, they are practical commandments that take the fire's physics seriously. You find yourself repeating them because repetition gives them the dignity of ritual. Structures above the level of shop and house force the most pained judgments. Churches are counted, and counting requires a rub of disbelief against memory. There were so many. There cannot be so many again, not soon. The city, with its characteristic mixture of economy and reverence, decides which to rebuild and which to fold into the care of neighbours. It is a hard arithmetic. The map of piety must be redrawn to match the map of practicality. A list is made of churches that will rise again, and another list of parishes that will share. It is not a betrayal to say that a parish can pray a little further from home when home is rubble. But you hear in every such decision the whisper of a wound that will not heal until bells ring across a map that feels familiar underfoot again. To make all this possible, law must bend and then be set straight. In the weeks after Ash, the old language of lease and rent is too tight for new facts. If a tenant owes rent for a shop that is now square sky, how shall that obligation be justly weighed? If a landlord held covenants to repair in ordinary times, what does repair mean when repair is indistinguishable from birth? These questions do not visit only magistrates. They infiltrate conversations on doorsteps and under awnings, men and women who have always treated contracts as the city's outer skin now feel them as inner bones that must be set properly, or else crookedness will hurt with every movement. You are grateful when you hear that a special forum, quick, focused, intolerant of delay, will take these disputes and turn them into future peace. People call it simply the court for the fire, and the name feels right because it is both humble and precise. While the court's form is being stamped, a series of proclamations fills the gap between emergency and order. You hear the king's will and the city's sense meet in decrees against price gouging, in rules about how materials may be stored so they do not become hazards, in orders that markets open where people can reach them even if those places feel wrong to habit. The small cruelty of urgent governance is unavoidable. You cannot place a timber yard next to a row of tents. You cannot sell oily goods in a hut with a rush roof. You cannot hoard brick when walls keep weather off children's lungs. These are the sorts of sentences that make people grumble even as they comply. And in the murmur you hear the city's healthy resistance to power, checked by the memory of the wind that did not check. There are, too, early gestures of commemoration that you almost miss because they look like ordinary acts of measurement. A tall site near where flame began is left clear, and a foundation mark is set that implies a pillar will rise to measure the height of caution. You see a mason's chisel cut neat letters into stone, simple, factual, because memory, to do its work, does not need flourish. The city intends to remember, not to shudder, to teach, not to accuse, to wrap the future in the past's instruction without suffocating it. You feel the wisdom of a memory that points forward. Materials alone do not make a safer city, habits do. In tenements, as they are rebuilt, the rules reach into everyday life. Hearths must be lined and flues placed so sparks cannot wander across a beam hidden in plaster. Doorways must not be blocked by storage that will become a trap when speed is required. Ladders must be kept where ladders can quickly be placed, not buried behind a winter's worth of rubbish. You watch a builder speak these rules to a household with a gentle force that feels like the way a mother instructs a child, not to punish, but to prevent the need for punishment. The city's rescue has passed from the hands of men with hooks to the hands of women who will not tolerate candles set under drying cloth, and men who will no longer accept a thatch tucked under an eave just for now. As for the grandest of structures, the debate about the largest ruin moves in a rhythm you can feel, even if you are never invited to the rooms where it is expressed. There is talk of whether stone can be trusted as it was, whether the old pattern of roof and vault must be altered to recognize what heat taught too brutally, whether to attempt a return to what was, or to embrace something more fitting to weather and wind and modernity. The impatience of those who lost everything presses against the patience needed for these decisions. It is an honest tension, the sort that creates new disciplines in men who thought themselves already disciplined enough. You begin to understand why a great city needs both theorists and carpenters, and how neither can be allowed to own the outcome alone. As chains stretch and rods sprout and kilns smoke, money begins to move as surely as mortar runs into joints. Levies are discussed that will be fair enough to be borne and clever enough to encourage not just rebuilding, but the right kind of rebuilding. The broadest costs must be shared, the city says, because the wind did not select by income, and the remedy cannot be a private luxury. Yet private ingenuity is not to be smothered. You hear proposals that reward speed without letting speed drive out standards that acknowledge a landlord's capital and a tenant's sweat, that turn the ravenous need for materials into a stable trade rather than a scramble. In one corner of a tent office, a man with a small seal presses it into warm wax on a document that will permit a line of houses to rise in a form that will keep air moving in the next dry summer. The act looks like ritual. It is the city acknowledging that its safety requires signatures as well as stones. What remains most striking to you in these first weeks is how boring the work is and how profound that boredom feels. The city saved itself from fire in noise. It will save itself for the future in repetition. A measuring chain does not care for romance. A plumb line is a tyrant of upright. A setback is a number, not a feeling. And yet in the careful insistence of these instruments you hear the city's most faithful voice. It says that survival is a matter of inches and minutes, of forbidding projection beams, and of insisting on guttering that takes water to drains that do not clog. It says that the next time wind decides to teach, the lesson will find fewer accomplices. By the time the first rows of new fronts begin to show the shy shine of fresh mortar, people are already treating them the way they treat any new thing, appraisingly, with a pinch of suspicion and an appetite for comfort. You hear in the gossip that winds through the markets in the fields an acceptance that brick and stone must take pride of place where timber once boasted. You also hear the human desire to mark a new beginning with a small flourish, an arch more graceful than strictly needed, a window's lintel carved just enough to catch the eye. These flourishes will be argued in offices later. For now, they are the way a city reminds itself that it is not only a wall against weather, but also a place where eyes need something lovely after months of ash. As you walk back across a rough edge where the old city's alley becomes the new city's straightened line, you realize that the largest unresolved question is not in brick stacks or plan sheets, but in the balance between pace and promise. If the money flows and the chains stretch and the courts decide with crisp fairness, the city will indeed rise, but what will it rise into? The smallest necessary corrections or the larger intention to make a capital that breathes, that does, not collect flame like dust, that turns its temptations to cram and overreach into a stricter affection for spacing and limit. In the pause before the first winter rain, you find yourself asking whether the dull, necessary virtues of measurement and habit will be allowed to finish, what noise could not, or whether habit, older, cozier, insistent, will pull too hard on the sleeve and bring the city back to the very edges from which the flame so recently taught it to step away. You enter the months when argument is treated like a craft. The fire's roar has given way to a different sound, a clerk clearing his throat, a judge's voice kept level, the scratch of pens writing names upon names. You stand at the edge of a crowded chamber where people who have never met, except as neighbors, now face each other with papers in their hands and a tiredness that goes beyond sleep. The benches are filled with a mixture of trades you could list by smell and posture alone. A baker with flour ground into his cuffs even now, a draper smoothing an imaginary crease, a carman whose hands wrap around a hat brim as if it were reins, a landlord in sober cloth that signals money held mostly on paper. Between them, the city has created a mechanism that did not exist before the flames, a special court assembled only because the ordinary forms would have taken years to disentangle a knot that needs a season, not a decade. You grasp its purpose before anyone tells you. Ownership in a city is not a simple thing. One man owns the ground, another holds the house for a term of years. Another rents the rooms month by month, another sublets. Another takes a corner for a workbench and a pallet by silent agreement and a bit of coin. The fire erased timber and plaster, but did not erase claims. If the city tried to resolve these claims with its usual patience, people would be living under canvas when winter is already giving their lungs a rasp. So here, A set of judges accustomed to the weight of property and the subtlety of contracts sit together with a charter to decide quickly, finally, and with regard for rebuilding more than for precedent. You notice that juries are absent in this forum. The judges here question and pronounce with an eye always fixed upon two questions that stand behind the rest: who can build and what will make it fair to do so. The rhythm of one day becomes familiar. Cases are called in batches. A clerk recites names and tenures that sound like a geography lesson because they trace a vanished street by its doorways. A landlord speaks first, then a lessee, then a sub-lessee, and sometimes the widow of a tenant whose husband stood in line with a hook 3 days and fell on the fourth. Evidence here is not elaborate. It is often a matter of describing what stood where and for how many years. Deeds, charred at the edges and smelling of damp, are unfurled. Rentals are read out in a monotone that counts more than it persuades. You catch the pattern. The court asks who had the longest interest and the greatest investment, and then it weighs those things against each other as a shopkeeper weighs goods on a beam scale. You learn an unexpected vocabulary of fairness. Rents are not declared merely due or forgiven. They are abated for time lost by the visitation, a phrase that gives the fire the grammar of a visitor who refused to leave. Leases that would have expired before a rebuilt shop could earn again are extended so that the man who takes the risk of rebuilding will see a return that is not eaten by the calendar. Sometimes the landlord is ordered to contribute to walls and roofs because, in a time of scarcity, the person who holds the ground has access to credit that the man with a bench and a couple of apprentices does not. Sometimes the tenant is permitted to build with an assurance that the rent will not rise simply because the walls are now brick and the front is finer, an assurance that prevents rebuilding from becoming a disguised eviction. The speed is what astonishes you. In ordinary times, a single dispute about a boundary could feed a term's worth of hearings and a clerk's family for a season. Here, decisions arrive in the space between two coughs. The judges do not despise argument. They curtail it because hunger and weather do not wait. They make records, but the records are tools, not trophies. Orders are written in a hand legible to masons as well as to men who wear gowns, and copies are carried out into the street like permission slips for workmen to begin. You see relief that is not joy, but the release of a cramp. A man who knows at last which wall is his to stand, which expense is his to bear, which day his rent sleeps and which day it wakes. While judgment shapes claims, the ground is being measured into rules. The rebuilding act, when it arrives, reads as dull as you expected and more significant than you imagined. It speaks in numbers because numbers do not burn. It tells you what materials may be used on exteriors where lanes are tight and tempers shorter. It names widths for streets that carry the city's largest traffic. It specifies the thickness of party walls, the manner of hearths, the placing of chimneys, the heights that houses may achieve relative to the breadth of the way before them. It forbids what daily life had once loved, because what daily life had loved turned under wind into danger. Jettying, those charming overhangs that made upper stories kiss each other over a street, is banished. Timber facings are allowed only where fire would not run from one to the next. Stone and brick must take that work, backed by mortar that hardens like reason. You discover that the act, which looks like a net of restrictions, is also a fabric of permissions. It imagines 4 sorts of houses sorted by the dignity of the street and the expected weight of trade. The grandest class, facing the broadest ways, may run higher, but only if their walls have the thickness of prudence and their roofs the shape that discourages sparks. The humbler sorts, tucked on lanes that serve, rather than display, are lower by rule but also less likely to become chimneys under a dry east wind. This hierarchy of forms is not flattery, it is a physics lesson written as law. Builders adapt, quickly because builders always do. A mason sees in a table of wall thicknesses the outline of his next year's bread. A carpenter reads a prohibition on projecting beams and understands he must teach his apprentices how to frame a different kind of floor. You walk with surveyors who have taken to carrying sticks not only to point, but to lay on the ground as arguments that everyone can see. A setback measured in feet is explained with a stick laid that many feet from a foundation line. A neighbour nods because he can see that a cart will pass where it once stuck. A party wall's thickness is drawn on dust with a boot heel, boots belonging to men who wear gowns one day and walk construction sites the next. You discover that the distance between thought and matter is shorter than you supposed when the thought has a number and the matter is hungry to be stacked, jointed and plumbed. The act speaks as well to water and waste in a way you recognize as the city remembering its older, quieter infrastructure. Drains must be laid with slopes that will carry away filth and not leave it to stew in cellars whose windows sit below pavement level. Gutters must be maintained without the excuse that the responsibility belongs to someone else farther up the street, because someone else is a habit that lets water collect and rot become a guest. The commissions that oversee sewers and paving feel momentarily glamorous because they are spoken of with urgency, but their labor remains what it has always been, the centered pride of those who keep a city comfortable by keeping it clean. Amid regulations and judgments, two figures pass and repass through your view in a way that stitches the legal to the physical. One is the kind of surveyor who can talk to a mason without condescension and to a dean without flattery. He carries in his head an inventory of angles and tolerances and a willingness to surrender a beautiful line on paper to a workable line on earth when property lines and livelihoods insist. The other is a designer of uncommon patience, capable of seeing a ruin as not merely the absence of a roof, but as a chance to make a roof whose weight is borne differently, whose spaces are not a tinderbox, whose beauty is not an indulgence, but a method of persuasion. You notice them listening more than speaking. They gather the city's anxieties and return them as drawings and stakes and measured admonitions about thickness, height, and span. In lanes where the court has given permission and the act has set terms, the first real rebuilding of houses shifts from theory to practice. Brick shows itself to be a different teacher than timber. It demands a pace. A wall can only be raised so high before the mortar must rest and the day's heat give way to night's cool. You see that this pace, which frustrates those whose hands itch to complete, is a kind of safety folded into the material. A bricklayer's line gives instructions silently. A plumb bob renders verdicts without argument. You adjust to the notion that safety is not a thing added at the end, but a thing built into every course and joint. Inside the new walls, the act's reach becomes intimate. Hearths are cased with brick, so that heat does not lick at framing. Flues are carried separate, so smoke does not meet and argue in a void and find its way into a beam. Floors are framed shy of flues with a strictness that will grow boring precisely because it makes flames work harder. Stairs are given better footing and clearer rise, so that feet running in alarm find steps that agree with them rather than the tricking them into a fall. These are not dramatic inventions. They are old lessons codified and made habitual. You say them to yourself as a litany because litanies sink into bone. No timber cheeks to chimneys, no voids without a mind for how air moves, no overhangs that collect wind and scatter heat. The court's energy, which you felt first as a pressure in the chest, settles into a cadence that allows you to predict good outcomes more often. You learn that a landlord who claims everything and offers nothing will find little favor. A tenant who demands rights as if risk were a stranger will be instructed in the arithmetic of shared obligation. What the court teaches subtly is that the city is a fabric woven from different kinds of strength. Ground gives capital, trade gives motion, lease gives structure to time, dwellers give the city its living content, the judgments that make rebuilding. Possible, therefore, trade absolutes for balances, extensions of leases matched to commitments to build, abatements of rent matched to conditions about materials and dates, contributions to party walls matched to responsibilities for maintenance, written so clearly that two men cannot pretend to have misunderstood each other when the next repair day comes. Outside the hearing rooms, you witness an odd correction happening, in the markets as well. Prices, which leapt like sparks in the first weeks, begin to settle under the twin weights of enforcement and habit. An order against sharp dealing feels severe in words, but in practice it nudges men back toward the way. They normally think of themselves as fair dealers who need to eat tomorrow and the day after, not only today. Merchants who tried on the costume of profiteer quickly discover that a city of watchful eyes makes such costumes itch. You notice that reputation, which could be traded unnoticed in quiet times, has been made visible by disaster. A man negotiates prices in the morning and finds his manner repeated back to him in a different market by afternoon, because the city's mouth has become one big ear. And yet, for all the progress you feel in your own thinking, the drag of the old map, stand at a corner where two widened streets meet, and you will find your feet wanting to turn into the narrow way that is gone. Memory will send you toward a vanished yard as surely as a magnet draws iron. The court and the act cannot legislate your legs. They can only make it easier to train them anew by aligning the city's surfaces with the promises made by its rules. You practice, like everyone else, by walking, by making turns where the new corners suggest, by letting the new widths teach you that carts need not clash wheels, that a tug of horses can pull through without snarling, that a blaze, should it come, will meet less of the city's ordinary conspiracy in its favor. As the year turns, you hear the first hints of impatience from people who thought the courts would burn as hot as the fire, and who now must learn that law's pace, even quickened, has the dignity of carefulness. Cases still come, disputes need sifting. But at the same time, stone stacks lower into walls, and walls acquire windows, and windows take glass, without the wastage of heat blisters, and roofs cover rooms where families can move their bundles up from the fields. You hear a bell ring from a church whose tower has been repaired enough to carry its voice again, and that sound strikes you as a polite suggestion that while law continues to measure fairness inside rooms, the city is learning to measure itself outside with wall thicknesses, with gutter widths, with distances between eaves and the ground. In a pause between cases one morning, you step outside the court and lean your back against a warm wall, warm not from flame, but from a weak, sun-catching brick. The judges within are still speaking, still writing. The act on paper within is still being read aloud in impatient, necessary fragments to people who will leave and translate it into hinge alignments and hearth depths. You close your eyes and picture the city 3 years on. Walls straight, lanes unpinched, drains not sulking, hearths behaving as hearths must. The question that intercepts the picture is not grand, and yet it matters. Once the bargains are struck and the rules are embodied in brick, will the city remember to enforce the dull cares, the sweeping of gutters, the keeping of ladders free, the reporting of a loose tile, without needing another visitor from the east wind to come and remind it, or will habit, that old friend and old danger, sip away the attention until a fresh set of mistakes is poured into the cups the law set. Out so carefully. You begin amid scaffolds and chalk lines in a city that has learned to speak softly while doing work that will outlast tempers and memories. The fire is no longer the subject of every sentence. The subject now is alignment. You walk with a surveyor, whose chain clicks against paving stones newly bedded, and he speaks not of ruins, but of widths. Where carts once argued at corners, the passage now expects them, and the argument has been settled by inches hammered into law. The rebuilding act has passed from paper into practice, and the practice is visible in small things as much as grand ones, in the way a doorway pulls back from the lane, in how a windowsill carries less timber and more brick, in the patient refusal to allow an overhang to slip back into habit, simply because it pleases the eye. You notice that the city's taste is adjusting, not through lectures, but through the pleasure of breathing better in streets that no longer pinch your lungs. In the courts devoted to settling claims, speed has matured into steadiness. The judges, no longer urgent with the heat of a crisis, have acquired a rhythm that turns conflict into agreements written with a hand that does not wobble. You hear less shouting in the hall and more murmured assent, because people can see the shape of the future taking weight. When a landlord agrees to contribute to a party wall, he does so with a calculation that will be checked by brick counters on the ground. When a tenant accepts a longer lease tied to specific materials and dates, he is accepting not merely time, but a set of obligations that will be inspected by eyes that now know the difference between a good joint and a lazy one. The court's achievement, which is easy to miss in the quiet, is to turn fairness into a timetable and to make patience worth more than a clever bluff. Workshops. Hum. You enter a yard where brick is stacked in courses that look like music, written in clay, and the master's voice is almost tender as he taps each unit to hear the ring that means soundness. Mortar is mixed with an order that has the dignity of ritual. Lime slaked with water that has not carried away its temper, sand sifted to remove stones that would ruin a joint, proportions measured by a labourer who does not look up to see if anyone is watching, because he is busy watching for the texture that will hold in the sun. Carpenters too are working, but with a new humility before the fire's lesson. They frame floors that keep shy of chimneys by a span you can measure. With a hand, and they write those distances on laths in pencil, so an apprentice will be reminded tomorrow that safety is not a story, but a number. Churches are rising again, but their count is a lesson in economy. You stand in a clearing where stones are being measured for foundations, and you hear a catalogue of parishes, spoken not as a dirge, but as a plan. Some will be rebuilt in full, others will share. Bells will be rehung, but not everywhere, and the rhythm of Sundays will adjust. The people accept this with more grace than you expected. Perhaps that is because the city has taught them in every other way what it means to live with fewer overhangs and more space between. Or perhaps because the walk to a neighbouring parish feels less like loss and more like a habit that will teach them new names in pews they did not notice before. You sense that community has wideness in it, and that wideness has been forced to the surface by streets that carry air better than they did. The largest ruin asks the hardest questions and receives the most measured answers. You look across a site that once held a forest of timber above a maze of stone, and you watch men take dimensions with a care that is almost a prayer. They have learned that beauty and safety are not enemies but partners with different temperaments. The new design will rise more slowly than the impatient wish, because it will be born not only of devotion but of geometry re-understood. When the first walls take their height, skepticism softens into curiosity, and curiosity becomes respect. You do not need to know the names of those who drew the lines. You can read their intention in the way light will move and in the absence of. Those traps the fire exploited. Markets creep back into the center, and with them the music of barter and prices. In lanes now wider, stalls are set with a margin that is not only comfortable but strategic. The old practice of storing fuel under a counter has given way to a rule that keeps tinder away from canvas. A huckster sighs as she carries her goods. A dozen steps further to the permitted place, but she also appreciates the absence of the smoky tang that used to settle in her throat by mid-morning. The city explains the rules on boards set at eye level, where to stand, what to avoid, how to keep passage clear. You remark that the boards are not scolds, they are reminders of a shared project to make this space less quarrelsome with weather and chance. Where once men muttered that rules are traps, now they note, with the resigned dignity of experience, that rules are a roof you cannot see. Water, the patient enemy and friend, is being coaxed into better behavior. Underfoot channels are relayed with falls that carry away filth that used to linger, less out of malice than out of neglect. Above, gutters are fixed to pitches that persuade rain to serve drains rather than rot timber. You accompany a crew that clears silt, and you listen to the foreman explain in a tone both bored and proud how an ounce of slope measured correctly now saves a pound of stench and a future day of fever. It is not romantic work. That is precisely why it matters. The city's highest ideas are, finally, gutters that do not sulk and pipes that do not hiss, only air when hands reach for water. You walk away with the taste of metal and wet lime in your mouth and the sense that comfort is the fruit of 100 uncelebrated labors. In the fields where households settled during the crisis, the bundles have thinned, and the provisional city of trunks and stools has become a marketplace for second chances. A man sells a cart he no longer needs because his goods now rest behind a brick front with proper joists. A woman trades a brazier for a broom with the angle she prefers because the hearth in her new room draws well and reads the smoke like a good book. Children, who learned the city by its empty places, map it anew by the presence of doorways where there were none last month. They play at being surveyors, counting paces between posts and settling arguments with string and knots, echoing the serious work that, in their eyes, has made the ground friendly again. You pause at a corner where a monument is rising, patient and pale. The foundation is a cylinder of meaning, a record chiseled in echoing letters that will tell a story without footnotes or heat. The choice to mark without scolding, to measure without blaming, is itself a policy. A pointer to the sky instructs future eyes to look up and remember, then to look down and walk carefully. You find yourself appreciating the compromise, grief turned into stone that refuses hysteria, caution taught by height rather than by a shouted accusation. Memory, you realize, can be useful architecture when it refuses to be an argument. Within houses, daily life adjusts to new habits that will harden into culture. Lamps have their places. Spaces under stairs are kept for brooms, not for bundles of kindling. Windows, now often soldered into lead with fresher skill, open where they used to stick, and the air's movement is part of the new domestic politeness. You watch a woman teach a child to shut the hearth with a care that looks like affection. The child's hand learns the weight of the iron and the exact sound of the door when it catches. These lessons, multiplied across streets and years, are what keep disasters from recruiting helpers in every household. There is pleasure in them too, because righteousness in such matters feels like comfort rather than punishment. The city's finances have recovered the rhythm of risk and promise. Levies laid to share the cost of improvement meet their mark. Investors with a nose for long returns put money into walls as if they were lending to a man with honorable habits. The cleverest. Part of this recovery is not the cleverness at all. It is the refusal to oversell. No one promises a city that cannot burn. What they promise instead is a city that will make it harder for flame to find accomplices, that will train its people to see danger at its small beginnings, that will keep space for carts and ladders and damp cloths and honest labor. You find this modesty reassuring because it resembles truth more than triumph. You end where you began, with a question of inches. Walk the new street where once two people could not pass with dignity on a rainy day, and count your steps. Feel how your shoulders do not brush timber. Notice how the doorways give a little room for turning, how the eaves no longer whisper to each other across the road. It is not dramatic. It is better than dramatic. It is the kind of improvement that becomes tradition in a generation and is then forgotten except when someone opens an old plan and marvels at how close things once were. You cannot help asking, as you look along a line that now respects both air and fire, having turned law into space and space into habit, will the city continue to tend these unobtrusive virtues, or will convenience, bit by bit, try to fit too much again into corners that were only just persuaded to stop conspiring with the wind?